The lesson everyone thinks they learned from Venezuela is the wrong one. On the 3rd of January 2026, U.S. forces captured a sitting president without invading a country. No shock and awe, no occupation, just speed, intelligence, and total dominance of the battlefield before the first boot touched the ground. And within hours, a dangerous idea spread. If Washington could do this in Caracas, why couldn't Beijing do it in Taipei? Some call it a shortcut, a clean strike. Remove the leader, collapse the system, solve the Taiwan problem overnight. But here is the uncomfortable truth. What worked in Venezuela is almost designed to fail in Taiwan. Different society, different political DNA, different kind of resilience. If you're watching this to understand modern power, this matters because misreading this lesson could lead to catastrophic decisions. Stay with me. Because before we ask what China might copy, we need to understand what the United States actually did and why the context mattered more than the operation itself. At its core, this debate is not about tactics. It is about systems. Operation Absolute Resolve is often described as a special forces raid. That description misses the point. The operation succeeded because it exploited a state already hollowed out from within, economically weakened, politically distrusted, and institutionally fragile. In Venezuela, power was personal. Remove the person, and the system trembled. Taiwan is built differently. Power is distributed, not concentrated. Authority flows through institutions, elections, laws, and an active civil society. Leadership matters, but it is not singular, and it is not brittle. This distinction changes everything. A decapitation strategy assumes that fear travels faster than legitimacy, that once the top is removed, obedience follows. That assumption only holds where governance depends on loyalty to a ruler, not confidence in a system. So the real question is not whether China can replicate the method. It is whether the mechanism would work in a political environment designed to absorb shock rather than collapse under it. To see why this difference is decisive, we need to step back and understand how Venezuela and Taiwan arrived at such radically different places. To understand why Venezuela cracked and Taiwan likely would not, we need to look at the paths that led them here. Venezuela's state did not fail overnight. It eroded slowly. Years of economic collapse hollowed out institutions. Hyperinflation destroyed trust. Political purges replaced professionalism with loyalty. Over time, fear substituted for legitimacy. By the time U.S. forces moved, the regime survived more on coercion than consent. Command structures existed, but confidence inside them did not. When pressure came, the system bent instead of fighting back. Taiwan followed the opposite trajectory. Its modern history produced redundancy, not fragility. Power is divided across branches of government. Leadership is contested, not personalized. Elections rotate authority. Law defines succession. This creates something authoritarian systems lack: shock absorbers. Even a sudden leadership loss would trigger legal continuity, not paralysis. Government would continue, commands would still flow, society would mobilize, not freeze. This difference is why copying Venezuela's outcome without its conditions is an illusion. And it sets the stage for the first real stress test in this comparison, the moment when theory meets crisis. The first real crisis in this story is not hypothetical. It already happened online. Within hours of Maduro's capture, Chinese social media lit up. Calls for replication. Arrest Taiwan's leader. End the problem fast. This was not state policy, but it revealed something important: how seductive decapitation looks from a distance. From the outside, Operation Absolute Resolve appeared clean, fast, low cost, minimal resistance, a leader removed, a regime neutralized, but that image hid the most critical variable: internal decay. In Venezuela, years of distrust meant no one was eager to die for the system. Orders existed, but belief did not. When pressure arrived, hesitation followed. That is the trap of surface level analysis. It focuses on the final move, not the conditions that made it possible. If you are trying to understand power in 2026, this is where many get misled. They copy outcomes instead of causes. They admire speed without asking what collapsed first. And that misreading matters because the next step is where strategy either matures or breaks. If this analysis is sharpening how you see modern conflict, keep going with me. Because now we need to open the black box and expose the hidden mechanics behind the operation itself. What made Operation Absolute Resolve work was not bravery, it was architecture. Before a single operator moved, the battlefield was already owned. Air, sea, cyber, space, information, every domain was synchronized. Intelligence was not centralized, it was fused. Decisions were not delayed, they were delegated. This is networked power at its highest level. The United States did not rely on a single strike. It relied on a system where sensors, shooters, and decision makers moved as one. That system allowed speed without chaos and precision without hesitation. This is where comparisons to China begin to break down. Hardware can be purchased, platforms can be built, but decentralization cannot be rushed. The PLA is still rehearsing joint force integration at scale. Command culture remains cautious. Initiative flows upward, not outward. In a mission where seconds matter, that difference is decisive. And even if the mechanics could be replicated, the environment could not. Taiwan is dense, watched, alert. Its defenses are designed not to win instantly, but to deny surprise. Which means the real danger is not that decapitation is impossible. It is that attempting it would expose weaknesses before achieving results. And that realization leads directly to the next escalation, where pressure increases, risk compounds, and restraint is tested. The second crisis comes not from imitation, but from escalation. Once decapitation loses its promise, pressure doesn't disappear. It mutates. If Beijing ever moves, it would not be with handcuffs and helicopters. It would be with distance. Missiles instead of raids. Shock instead of seizure. Precision strikes aimed at leadership nodes. Command centers. Psychological dominance, not physical arrest. This is where the danger sharpens. Such a move would not be designed to collapse Taiwan overnight. It would be designed to terrify, to overwhelm decision makers, to force negotiations before clarity emerges. But here again, the comparison to Venezuela breaks. Taiwan has planned for this moment. Counter-decapitation units, hardened command chains, redundant leadership, exercises built around surviving the first blow, not preventing it. The result is a paradox. The harder the strike, the stronger the backlash. The more violence used, the faster legitimacy consolidates. This is the point where many strategies fail, not militarily, but politically. Because coercion that does not collapse a system often hardens it. And that is why the real battlefield is no longer abstract. It is human, personal, felt by ordinary people. Which brings us to the part most strategic debates forget. What all of this means for you. This is where the human cost and the emotional truth enters the equation. In Venezuela, ordinary citizens were largely spectators. They had little capacity to resist and little expectation that the system could protect them. Shock rippled through the elite, but daily life continued under new authority. In Taiwan, the story would be radically different. You, me, the people on the street, everyone is a stakeholder. Civil society is active, media is vigilant, and social networks amplify every signal. A decapitation strike would not quietly neutralize leadership. It would galvanize the population, creating resistance and outrage. This is where strategic intent collides with societal reality. Even if Beijing were capable of seizing top leaders, the broader goal, political control, unification, would face enormous friction. Chaos alone does not translate into consent. Enforced compliance risks long-term backlash, not quick resolution. For you watching this, the lesson is clear. Power is measured not only in firepower, but in resilience, cohesion, and the human response to sudden shocks. If you are following closely, take this insight forward, because the global ripples of such decisions reach far beyond borders, and they inform the next layer of analysis, the international consequences. The shock of a decapitation attempt does not stay contained, it spreads globally. Latin America watched closely. Some countries condemned the US action in Venezuela as a violation of sovereignty. Others quietly supported it, seeing stability restored after chaos. Global reactions were nuanced, not uniform. For China, this matters. Any operation against Taiwan would not occur in a vacuum. International pushback would be swift. Allies of Taiwan would likely accelerate support military, economic, and diplomatic. Sanctions, deployments, and global condemnation could isolate Beijing in ways that Caracas never did. Even the perception of success is tricky. In Venezuela, the US could work with a cooperative vice president. In Taiwan, removing the top leadership would not guarantee pro-China figures' rise to power. Public outrage and institutional resilience would blunt the intended effect. At the strategic level, this demonstrates a profound truth. Context shapes outcome. What works against one system fails in another. And this sets the stage for contemplating the future not as a blueprint, but as scenarios shaped by complexity, risk, and unintended consequences. Next, we examine the paths that future conflict could take and what three very different scenarios might look like. Now, we turn to the future three possible scenarios for Taiwan if Beijing attempted a decapitation strike. Best case, the attempt fails quickly. Taiwanese defenses absorb the shock. International support reinforces Taipei. Beijing faces global condemnation and is forced into negotiation or retreat. Resilience is validated and deterrence is strengthened. Middle case, the strike succeeds partially. Leadership is disrupted, but institutions hold. Chaos spreads, but Taiwan's constitutional and legal systems continue functioning. The population resists, protests surge, and international actors intervene to stabilize the situation. The outcome is uncertain, and the risk of escalation remains high. Worst case, a coordinated strike overwhelms key nodes, causing temporary paralysis. The public reacts unpredictably. Beijing attempts to fill the vacuum, but legitimacy and control are contested. International backlash intensifies. Even success comes at immense political, military, and reputational cost. Across all three scenarios, one lesson stands out. Decapitation is never a guaranteed shortcut. It is complex, risky, and context-dependent. For Taiwan, resilience and preparation, not surprise strikes, remain the ultimate defense. The next step is to close this analysis with insight and reflection, linking lessons learned to broader strategic thinking. Here is the conclusion, the insight, and the final call to reflection. Operation Absolute Resolve in Venezuela was extraordinary, but it was not universal. It succeeded because conditions were unique. A fragile state, a hollowed-out regime, and unparalleled US preparation. What worked there does not automatically translate to Taiwan. For China, attempting a similar decapitation would be fraught with risk. A resilient democracy, robust institutions, an alert population, and international scrutiny create barriers that no quick strike can bypass. Chaos alone cannot produce consent. Control cannot be seized without legitimacy. For you watching, the takeaway is clear. Power is measured not only in force, but in context, systems, and human response. Understanding this distinction is essential not just for scholars or strategists, but for anyone trying to make sense of global events in 2026 and beyond. And here is the final insight. Modern conflicts are less about single dramatic moves and more about complex interactions between institutions, societies, and international frameworks. The strongest lessons come from seeing the whole picture, not just the spectacle. If you want to understand what happens next on the global stage and how these lessons will ripple into the Indo-Pacific, stay tuned, because the next chapter is already unfolding, and the stakes have never been higher.